Hello, so we are Frontfellas. We are an organization that works in Ukraine. Our tasks include like bringing stuff to the front lines, bringing humanitarian aid to where it's needed, and we also want to do some reporting. And we will do it directly from here. And now another thing that we are going to do is to record some videos, analysis, and stuff like this. We will also conduct interviews with different people who are active in Ukraine. So yeah, stay tuned. Now this video will be about the developments in Bakhmut. There has been a lot of talking about this kind of stuff in the internet, so especially in the last days. So we thought we make a small analysis video and just talk about what's happening, what has happened before, and how things could develop in the future. In the initial phase of the full-scale invasion, Russia suffered a number of really embarrassing setbacks. So think about the attack on Kharkiv, which failed, the attack on Kiev, which failed, and the subsequent collapse of the northern front, so that Russian forces had to retreat like hundreds of kilometers and they were basically destroyed. A lot of equipment was captured by the Ukrainian army, including tanks, armored vehicles, ammunition, and the whole world saw that the Russian army wasn't really prepared for this kind of campaign. Also, the resistance of the Ukrainians was very fierce, which caught Russia off guard. After these initial setbacks, Russia changed its approach. They scaled back their ambitions and tried to attack Ukraine in another manner. So before we can talk about Bakhmut itself, we have to talk about this change of strategy because it relates to the Battle of Donbas. In order to understand how Russia changed its approach, we have to talk a little bit about military doctrine and military strategy and operational art. The best way to begin is with the First World War. The First World War was a conflict that shocked Europe. There was a kind of positional warfare, trench warfare, which meant that millions of people died without significant territorial gains, at least in the Western Front. And this meant that there wasn't any kind of big success that you could sell to the public. People were traumatized by this kind of warfare. And so the military theorists tried to think about ways to wage war differently, to break the stalemate of positional warfare and go back to a kind of war of movement, a maneuver warfare that would bring swift successes. To varying degrees, this drive to overcome the stalemate of trench warfare was a European phenomenon. There are some countries like France which didn't really buy into it. They believed that the next world war would still be a trench war like the First World War. But most countries tried to adapt their strategies, their doctrines, in order to create a new environment where dynamic movement would be possible. And two of the best examples for this are Germany and the Soviet Union. Actually, both countries even cooperated in a series of secret military exercises that were held in Soviet territory in order to develop their armaments, so tanks, aircraft, to train with them, and also to develop military doctrines. In the Soviet Union, this led to the development of something called deep operations doctrine, which can be traced back to two authors, on the one hand Trianfilov and on the other hand Tukhachevsky, both of which developed ideas which would later be used to create a new kind of operational style warfare system. In the Soviet Union, this led to the development of something called deep operations doctrine, which is commonly associated with people like Trianfilov, Isarson, and Tukhachevsky. These theorists developed a new kind of thinking about military affairs, which focuses on the operational level of war. So if we think about war, like maybe as amateurs or as normal people, we mainly think about the tactical level. So we think about individual platoons or companies moving around the battlefield, about flanking attacks, about maybe something like suppressing fire. We think about tanks and individual soldiers, their weapon systems. All of this belongs to the tactical level. So it refers to battalions fighting against each other, or maybe up to division level. And on the other hand, there's a strategic layer or level of war, which refers to countries and their industrial base, their population, how many people do we have, which resources exist in our country, how fast can we mobilize them, what is the state of our defense industry. So this is the strategic layer of war. According to the founders of deep operations theory, there's a layer in between those two, which is the operational. The operational level is mainly concerned with things like ground lines of communication. How do we bring logistics from the rear areas to the front? It also concerns itself with the movement of large formations like divisions or brigades, regiments, and how they can be used to overcome the enemy. For people like Tukhachevsky, this operational level of war is actually the decisive one, and one that has been under-theorized in previous military theories. The core of deep operations theory is the idea that wars are won not just by having a favorable ratio of kills to losses, so looking at how many tanks have we destroyed, how many tanks has the enemy destroyed, how many soldiers have we killed, how many soldiers have the enemy killed, but instead to defeat them operationally. And this is where the concept of depth comes into play. So what does it mean for an operation to be deep? It means that it targets not only the front line or the line of contact, but also the elements of the enemy defense that are, or offense, that are employed in the depth of the battle space. This includes the ground lines of communication, logistics centers, command and control, and units that the enemy moves to the front from the back areas. The idea is to attack these units simultaneously. At the same time, when the frontline battalions attack the first echelon of enemy defenses, air forces already engage the deep targets in the enemy rear. Once a breakthrough is achieved and the enemy front line collapses, there is something called an operational maneuver group, body of mechanized and armored forces that exploits the breakthrough and cuts the enemy lines of communication. According to people like Tukhachevsky and Isarson, this will also lead to an effect that they call systems shock or operational shock, which prevents the enemy from organizing a coherent defense by overwhelming them psychologically and information-wise. Imagine it like this, like you get so many reports from the front line that this is collapsing, this is happening, we are being attacked here and here, that you as a general lose track of what is actually happening and you can't coordinate your troops anymore. So the idea is to concentrate on the entire depth of the enemy defenses and shatter them with this coordinated blow that has multiple stages and that is meant to create a decisive result. Joseph Stalin was initially opposed to these new ideas, and he wanted to retain a more traditional military doctrine. But during the Second World War, and faced with the successes of the German army, they changed their minds. So the Soviets started using a deep operations approach, which was very successful in 1944, when they defeated the whole army group center of the German army, effectively rendering the Germans unable to continue the war in any meaningful sense. Like they could still hold out, but they lost all of their offensive potential in these strikes. The Soviet armies of the Cold War continued to use a modified form of deep operations doctrine. So, for example, their approach was very much focused on swift operations, on breakthroughs, on simultaneous attacks on the enemy rear, and on the use of operational maneuver groups, which would exploit success and therefore lead to a swift collapse of the enemy lines. This also explains why some of their tactical procedures, like standard operating procedures for individual platoons, battalions, companies, and so on, are rather crude for Western standards. So they were expected to move in lines. They didn't train small-scale unit tactics in the same way that the Western units did. And the reason for this is, on the one hand, of course, that they had a big conscript army, so they couldn't do it. But on the other hand, also that the deep operations approach requires you to be really quick. So it's better if the divisions or battalions of the first echelon take very high casualties, but they fulfill the time plan, so that once they are done, the operational maneuver group can exploit the success. If they need more time, like if the first wave needs too much time to break the enemy defenses, this would still disrupt the whole operation and give the enemy room and space and time to react. So they were very much focused on being quick, on being decisive, on using shock, and on using surprise to defeat the enemy. The Soviet way of war clearly influences also contemporary Russian doctrine. So I think that this is a part of the reason why Russia did this very daring offensive in the beginning of the war. But there's another thing that I think might have influenced them, and it is the American conduct in the Iraq wars. I guess it's fair to say that the Russians were also inspired by the American doctrine of rapid dominance, which was employed arguably in the Iraq War of 2003. This idea implies that you use overwhelming force to convince the enemy that resistance is futile. So you have to also be swift, to use rapid attacks, to use massive firepower to convince your enemy that they can't win. The thing is, it failed. So the Ukrainians were undeterred. They put up a lot of resistance. They fought heroically, and on the other hand, the Russians had these problems with logistics. They had problems with morale. They had problems with their planning. So the rapid approach didn't work. Neither Soviet deep operations doctrine nor the American idea of rapid dominance were applicable to the Russian war effort in Ukraine. So they changed their approach. They went back to something more akin to First World War practices. That means slow advances, thorough planning, a lot of artillery, and rather unambitious thrusts, which just take territory step by step, slowly grinding against the enemy to destroy their forces and capture territory. To employ this way of fighting, the Russians chose the Donbas region. So the Donbas offensive that happened after the initial setbacks employs another set of ideas, this kind of attritional, slow scale advance. And it had a lot of advantages for the Russians because it didn't rely on good logistics, it didn't rely on capable commanders. It's a rather easy way of fighting, and it allows the Russians to have short supply lines, which alleviated their problems with supplying their troops. So yeah, they attacked the Ukrainians in the Donbas. Initially, they didn't have a lot of success, and the reason for this is because the Ukrainian lines were basically the lines from the war of 2014. So they were very, very well defended lines with extensive trench networks, reinforced bunkers, and pre-sighted artillery. This meant that the Russian attacks had very high casualties and they couldn't breach the defenses for quite a while. But eventually they made it. And they made a breakthrough at the city of Popasna. This breakthrough threatened the entire Ukrainian effort in the Donbas. It made the 2014 defensive lines untenable. In order to better understand the significance of the fall of Popasna, we should take a look at the map. Here we can see the situation on June 15th. The orange arrow points to Popasna. As we can see, this one breakthrough has led to the fall of large areas that were formerly controlled by Ukraine, threatening the rear of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and therefore presenting a serious threat to the Ukrainian army. Luckily, the slow-paced approach chosen by the Russians meant that they didn't have a big operational maneuver group, so they took their time. And this allowed Ukraine to retreat its troops from the threatened areas and to prevent the encirclement of large Ukrainian formations. So the Ukrainians managed to retreat and to escape this trap, abandoning their 2014 positions, but saving their army from destruction. A look at the topographical map makes things even clearer. Popasna is positioned on high ground, which makes it a strong position from which one can observe and control the surrounding area. The 2014 defensive line was anchored on this position and on the Luhan River. If you look at the map, you can still see the extensive trench systems that were erected in this area. With the fall of Popasna, all of these positions became practically useless because the enemy was already behind them. The next viable defensive line can be seen here. It is the Bakhmutka River and the high ground to the west of it, which creates the Seversk-Bakhmut line. After the fall of the 2014 line, this was the only viable place to make the next stand. So topography in this case dictates operational art. So now that we're talking about the Battle of Bakhmut itself, the first interesting question is, why even fight it? A lot of people have argued that Ukraine shouldn't have chosen to fight this fight, that they should have retreated to other positions or just refused to engage in this battle. Even people like, for example, Lloyd Austin, the Defense Secretary of the United States, has claimed that Bakhmut doesn't possess any big strategic or operational value, that it's mainly a symbolic target. We should now take a look at the different arguments. So is Bakhmut important? Why is it important? And what does this mean for the whole battle? Lloyd Austin is not the only one who talks about the symbolic value of Bakhmut. The battle has become a symbol for Ukrainian resistance and for the Russian attack. It has become vitally important for the political career of people like Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. And it's just a place where the world looks at. So everyone talks about Bakhmut. Bakhmut is the thing. So this is why both sides can't afford to back down. This argument has some plausibility, but it's rather unlikely that the Ukrainian General Staff would decide to fight a battle that's unfavorable to them just to get a little bit of media attention. They could have immediately, for example, vacated the city, preventing it from becoming a symbol. And even now, it seems to be rather weird to lose so many soldiers just for a symbol. So I think that's not everything. One argument that's often used is the idea that the Battle of Bakhmut is a good attritional battle for Ukraine, meaning that Russia loses so much more people, so much more tanks, so much more equipment, and the Ukrainian losses are relatively low, that the ratio of kills to deaths favors Ukraine. We don't know whether this is true, because we have no confirmable numbers about the exact losses that both sides incur. The only thing that we can say for sure is that Russia has much more resources. They have more people, they have more tanks, they have more artillery shells. So the ratio of kills to deaths for the Ukrainian side must be really high to justify this fight from a purely attritional perspective. In an interview with Al Arabiya, Zelensky provided a different rationale. Let's look at the map again. There's only one obstacle between Kramatorsk and the Bakhmutka River, and that is the high ground that you can see here. Russia is only one defensive line away from Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, the last two big Ukrainian-held cities in Donetsk. Abandoning this Siversk-Bakhmut line would mean a Russian siege of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, and therefore the destruction of all of these houses, the people who live there. And this, for Zelensky, is the reason why Bakhmut has to be defended. And I think it's a very plausible one. Bakhmut is not just one city, it's part of a whole defensive line. The fall of this city would mean the fall of the defensive line as a whole, and therefore it would allow Russia to advance beyond the high ground by Chasiv Yar and to lay siege to these two big cities in Donetsk. And this is not something that the Ukrainian High Command can easily accept. Once Ukraine was committed to this fight, the Ukrainian General Staff had to constantly make difficult decisions. And one of those difficult decisions is how many troops to send into the city. Sending more troops means saving Ukrainian lives in the city, because then you can have more combat power, you can suppress more enemy forces, you can counterattack, you can hold positions. So it would save Ukrainian lives in Bakhmut. On the other hand, these troops, a lot of these troops that could be sent to Bakhmut are part of the Ukrainian strategic reserve. Troops which would be used for example, a counteroffensive or for counterattacks against unexpected Russian breakthroughs or something like this. Spending these troops in the defense of Bakhmut would mean a decrease of Ukrainian offensive potential and could therefore jeopardize any attempt to launch a successful counteroffensive. So this question had to be constantly weighed by the Ukrainian High Command, and there's no easy answer here. So they did something like a middle ground, something in between. They sent more troops to Bakhmut, but they still retained a large strategic reserve for potential counteroffensives. So now that we've dealt with these strategic and operational level questions, we should take a look at the tactical level. What happens actually in Bakhmut on the tactical level? And the thing to note is that this is attritional, positional warfare. It's a warfare, it's trench warfare. This means that there are high casualties on both sides. The battle space is dominated by artillery barrages, by infantry assaults, often by close-range fighting in buildings or in trenches. So it takes a high toll on both sides, and it doesn't present a lot of opportunities for maneuver warfare. It's mainly a war of position and not a war of movement. Now, when we talk about the fighting in Bakhmut, we should keep in mind that on the one hand, there's the city itself. On the other hand, there's the outskirts. And the outskirts of the city are open ground. So in some cases, it's a different style of fighting in the sense that you have more range, you can use armored vehicles more effectively, but it's still positional. It's then not buildings that people defend, but trench lines. In both cases, both in the city and outside of the city, we have this very static warfare, but it's still important to keep in mind that not the whole Battle of Bakhmut is a battle that takes place inside of the city. And this is actually similar to the Battle of Stalingrad, large parts of which were fought on the outskirts of Stalingrad in the open steppe. So it's, in this sense, rather similar to Stalingrad. When we talk about Bakhmut, one of the things that everyone thinks about is, of course, the Wagner Group. And there has been a lot of analysis going on about the question why Russia uses these private military contractors. Yeah, you can say, on the one hand, it's about recruiting those prisoners, which couldn't just be part of the normal regular army. Also to keep the official losses low, because these are not Russian soldiers, so if they die, it's not that bad for Russia. And also probably it's about internal politics. Vladimir Putin doesn't want to give one institution all of the power, so he creates these different competing power blocks, like, for example, the Chechens of Kadyrov, the Rosgvardia, like the internal troops, the regular army, and now also the private military contractors. For Wagner especially, Bakhmut has become the main focus of attention, and their reputation depends on this battle. We have obviously seen a lot of insane rants by Prigozhin complaining about the fact that he supposedly doesn't get the ammunition that he wants. Other people then deny it, and it goes back and forth. Then he said he wants to leave the city. Then again, he got the ammunition apparently. Then he again complains. So this is more or less something that they use to blame each other and to try to improve their internal position in Russia. For us, what is important on the tactical level is simply that Wagner uses these assault tactics where they send ill-equipped and badly trained conscripts as a first wave in order to identify Ukrainian positions, which are then attacked by artillery and by more professional Wagner mercenaries. One thing we know for sure is that Wagner had a lot of losses, and this is confirmed not only by the Ukrainians but also by Prigozhin himself. So they lose a large amount of people, and it seems that their morale is right now rather low, like that they complain, and that this is also a reason why Prigozhin has to make these videos, because he has to show his own troops that he cares, that he tries to improve the situation. Russia has been trying to capture the city of Bakhmut for almost 2 months now. In 2022, Russian assaults were generally ineffective, leading to thousands of casualties with minimal results. But with the capture of Solidar in January 2023, the operational situation changed. In a series of engagements that were very costly for both sides, Russia began to take ground, pushing the Ukrainian defenders back and threatening to surround the city. The situation was dire, and even the most optimistic of Ukraine's supporters had to deal with the possibility of the city falling. On the 9th of May, Prigozhin claimed that Russia had lost territory near Bakhmut, and that Russian forces were in disarray. This was later confirmed by the Ukrainian side. The 3rd Separate Assault Brigade conducted an assault against Russian trench lines south of Bakhmut. 2 Russian infantry companies were destroyed. We have images of Russian soldiers routing, we have images of Russian vehicles being destroyed, and it's clear that the assault liberated an area 3 kilometers wide and approximately 2 kilometers deep. So what can we see in these videos? Firstly, we can see that Russia mans prepared defensive positions. Now, in popular culture, we normally associate these prepared positions, these trenches, with the First World War alone. But actually, they are part of every country's standard operating procedures. When infantry units have to defend a piece of terrain and they don't have something like buildings or bunkers to hide in, they will construct defensive positions which can protect them from artillery fire, from direct fire, and which can be used to move in a more or less concealed way between, for example, alternative fighting positions to shoot maybe machine guns or anti-tank missiles, one time from this position, then from this one. So these trenches are a normal feature of war, but they always signal that the operational speed or the tempo of war fighting has slowed down because you need time to construct these defenses. What we also see is that the Ukrainians use combined arms tactics. So they employ infantry fighting vehicles, they employ tanks and artillery together as a whole. This is rather difficult, and it's absolutely necessary to be able to successfully attack prepared positions. So the fact that we can see Ukrainian soldiers do this in a professional manner shows that at least the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade is completely capable of conducting difficult offensive operations. One peculiar thing is the use of tanks at very close range. This can have a big effect on the enemy morale, and we can see even Ukrainian tanks running over Russian soldiers. But it's also rather dangerous because the Russians could use something like light anti-tank weapons, RPG-7s, to destroy those vehicles. So it's always something that may have high risk associated with it. Apart from this successful assault to the south of the city, we also know that Ukraine conducted successful attacks to the north. So they also took trench lines and they took territory to the north, and they managed to liberate an important supply route into the city. Inside of the city, on the other hand, Russia is still pushing, so that we have a situation where Russians are advancing in the center, but on the flanks, the Ukrainians are taking ground. The Russian Telegram channels were in panic mode. Prigozhin published videos where he says that the front is falling, that this is the big counteroffensive, and even on the pro-Ukrainian side, a lot of people have been talking about the idea that this now is the counteroffensive of Ukraine. However, what we've seen until now are just limited counterattacks. They are successful. They show that Ukraine can overcome these Russian defenses. They show that Russia has problems with coordination and morale, but they didn't break through the Russian lines, and they are not as yet part of a big counteroffensive. Should the Ukrainians decide to start a big counteroffensive, they might do it at Bakhmut. A success here would reconstitute the Seversk-Bakhmut line and thereby improve the defensive setup. Or they could try to go further to recapture Popasna and retake the original 2014 defensive line. Another option that has been debated is the attack somewhere else, for example, towards Tokmak or Melitopol. This would effectively cut Russian troops to the east of Kherson and destroy an important supply line to Crimea. Operations against Svatove in the north, or even against Belgorod, cannot be ruled out. We don't know where and when the counteroffensive is going to happen. It might be a big one, it might be a small one, we don't know. But there's one thing that is clear. A counteroffensive is always a big risk. And the larger the offensive, the larger the risk. A big offensive, a kind of deep operation, might be able to break the back of the Russian army, but it also might lead to a disaster for the Ukrainians. So we should keep this in mind. We shouldn't be too hyped for this one big push. It might be the case that Ukraine needs more time to prepare. One important question to keep in mind is whether we think that Ukraine or Russia have a bigger ability to sustain their forces in the long run. If we think that Ukraine has the ability to generate forces more quickly than Russia because of Western aid, then it makes sense for Ukraine to stall and not to put all eggs in one basket and attack right now. But if we think that the logic of attrition favors Russia, then Ukraine needs a swift counteroffensive in the near future. What Ukraine needs are more weapons, more tanks, more support, more medical equipment, and more people. So we should not stall in our support for this country for their fight for freedom. Because no matter what happens, if the Ukrainians are well equipped, they will be better able to stand against the Russian forces. But if we stop helping them, then Russia might still win. So please, people, support the Ukrainian forces and try to do everything you can to make this invasion stop and to give Ukraine a chance to win back their freedom and their territory. So that's it for now. Thank you for watching the video. Like and subscribe, and stay tuned for future content.